Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Cultural History of Canada, the first episode we've done in a month. You're welcome.
I love how subdued your opening was just because of how depressing our conversation was beforehand.
Okay, let me take that again then. Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Cultural History of Canada, our very first episode in a month.
There's my
no
forced
reason,
optimism in the face of overwhelming uncertainty.
for no other reason than I had other stuff to do. I'm sorry.
Manufactured optimism, baby. We love it.
Oh my god. You have to put a smile on for the content. Yay.
Remember, everything you see on an influencer's real life stories is manufactured as hell.
That's right. But I'm sure the audience feels the smile across the audio, you know?
They feel my smile of pain. And to all my students who are listening, no, Mr. Cooper's not depressed.
To all of Mackenzie's students, yes, he is. He cries himself to sleep at night, and you will never convince me otherwise.
No, I just stressed out about the oncoming ecological disaster that we're facing.
To any of my students who are listening, I cry myself to sleep.
That's true. That I can confirm.
So, Mac, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about Les Femmes au Québec, tabarnak. That's the title in the notes. That is what it is called. Episode 120.
All caps, women, Quebec, yay.
Women, Quebec, fuck. As a literal translation.
So I figured some of the things that we're going to be talking about today is stuff that we've at least addressed in other contexts, but I figured it would be at least useful to give the women of Quebec their due around the time that they got the right to vote, because as I'm sure you know, they got it way later than everyone else, basically, in Canada and almost every other woman in the world. So that's great.
You gotta love the Catholics.
Oh yeah, and this is again a very, very contingency heavy statement, right? That women in Quebec got the right to vote because Indigenous peoples and minority groups and all of that. There was all kinds of caveats for who could vote after this, but generally speaking,
as there always is.
Yes, but these episodes will come in their due time. By and large, what we're focusing
right now,
on today,
we're just talking about white women.
Yay!
Because we figured that's controversial enough for a couple of white dudes to talk about for now.
There isn't much controversy here. Some of it is stuff that we're like pretty familiar with, at least for me as a Quebecois raised person, right? As a Quebec raised person. But I also wanted to highlight how some of these elements demonstrated themselves in the literary world, because that's our bread and butter, right? Is literature and so on.
Do we get to talk about tradwives?
Sure. What do you want to talk about with tradwife?
Wait, do you know what a tradwife is?
I broadly know what it is. Like you're talking about the influencer thing.
Yeah. It's a trend at the moment for like usually, not always, but usually of a conservative or a neoconservative mindset, women that decide they want to go back to like traditional lifestyle. Mm-hmm. So they like wear the pretty dresses and they're going to cook and clean all the meals for their husband and all that, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Not small, but many issues with that lifestyle, as many of them are finding out, including the big one being that if you do all that, your husband is mostly just going to get home, drink, go to bed, and then sleep with his secretary. But technically speaking, if like again, because that's part of it, the whole tradwife influencer lifestyle also perpetuates the idea or concept of like
things were better,
removing women's rights, including the right to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, as we talked about when we were talking about other moments when suffrage was granted to segments of the Canadian population, that's not to say that these people were perfect either, right? Like some of the elements some of the women who were advocating for suffrage in Quebec, right, would have probably been quite traditional in other respects, right? They wouldn't have necessarily gone onto the labor market. It was 1940
Oh,
after.
it's how it goes. It's like famously Florence Nightingale was an
Mhm.
anti-suffragette, wasn't she?
That I can't speak to, but I wouldn't
But I know Florence
be
Nightingale was
surprised.
famously like in famous nurse and all that, saved a bunch of
Mhm.
lives, but then was also like anti-feminist. It was a really weird thing. People are
Okay.
complicated, essentially. People have
Yeah,
layers.
exactly. Hold on. Florence Nightingale anti-suffrage. Let's fact check you.
Was it? It was.
She apparently she didn't give it priority, but she wasn't against it actively. She was
There
just
you go.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
this can be like another issue somewhere down the line.
Right.
Yeah. But or um, in in the rest of Canada, in Alberta, for example, the famous five, right, which were famous suffragettes in the early 20th century and late 19th century, um, they were also eugenicists, right? So it's like not great.
Eugenics, baby, it's
It's
back.
it's funny because it's so absurd, but as you're saying, people are complicated,
Yeah.
right?
Let's get some phrenology in here. Let's start looking at people's skulls again.
Can we not? I for one vote against it.
Can I examine your skull so that way I can tell by the contours of your skull how stupid you are?
I don't think you need to measure my skull to tell that.
That's true. I just have to listen to the words that come out of your mouth.
Heyo.
Hey,
Uh,
got him, even though he got himself.
whatever it is, who cares?
So, how did this
But yeah,
actually
why did
start
you want to
happening?
start with tradwives? Like what did
Because
that?
I believe in making relevant modern connections. And I think it's
Okay.
interesting to take a look. I was talking about this with some of my students on Friday about like how we view feminism and how a lot of our views on feminism, especially its very Western viewpoint,
Yes.
and how like feminism has changed over
Hmm.
time to have different meanings. So like these women in their times obviously would have been main feminists as like as you're saying famous five suffragettes. But then there's also the fact that they were eugenicists, and that
Yeah.
probably would have been seen as almost like a good progressive thing at the time. And
For
so
some
it's
circles, yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
so it's an interesting way, like the way we look back at society and its makeup in its day, and how some things are different, some things stay the same, and how some things just turn back to what they were before.
Absolutely. And it is rather indicative, I think,
I
how.
mean, the
Yeah,
tradwife
go ahead.
trend is basically the same as the Renaissance movement, discovering
Mhm.
the old texts and old cultures of the old masters and putting them on in the modern day. Except, instead of the old masters, it's the goddamn like
The
I don't know,
old
Dictator
ideas that we threw
Republican.
in the bin for a very good reason.
Well, it's this idea again, it's this seeing as this golden age of manufacturing. That's what they're really
Yeah,
chasing.
yeah.
That manufacturing high. And they think they can do that just by like adopting some cultural norms without actually understanding the economic shifts that had been made by things like the
Mhm.
New Deal and all that to make that a possibility.
It's also chasing this idea of simplicity because there's all kinds of reasons why people argue that, but the idea that people have less free time on their hand or feel like they're much more.
I think that's what the
Yeah,
trad wife really envisioned. The fact that they'll just
yeah.
cook clean and then they'll have all this free time or whatever to watch their shows and be on social media and blah blah blah. And it's like, no, no, no. If you're saying you're gonna do this, the man's gonna make you do all of it. You're gonna be taking care of the kids 24/7. You're gonna
Hmm.
be cooking. Like if the meals aren't good, like he's gonna do something about it. If it's gonna be this, like you have to follow
It's
through on all of it.
even if it wasn't following through on all of it, it also misses the point of why people stopped doing it in the first place, or why women wanted to stop doing it in the first place, is because it's
Because they couldn't
freaking
afford to.
alienating.
Yep.
Yeah, it like you don't feel like a fully realized person when you do that, right? And that's
Yep.
awful. um. Anyway, that's. But
Or
no,
your sense of self is like very specifically tied only to like
mhm,
one thing.
exactly. And yeah, there's a whole lot to say about this, but there's there is something to be said
Especially
about.
a lot to be said by two white men.
No, but I know you're making it as like a half joke, but I think
No,
historically, yeah,
yeah,
it's there is a lot to say
it's
about the fact that when the shifts that happened in society post all of these rights being granted to all kinds of people, whether it's women, minorities, and so on, did lead to a more complicated life or a more charged life for a lot of people. That's not to say it's a worse life. I think this is all great that we granted rights to these various groups. But I do understand the desire by certain people to want to go back to that norm, that impulse. Yes, I get that impulse. Yeah. I don't think it's a good impulse to follow through on, but I understand where it comes from. Yeah.
So let's talk about Quebec and its history then specifically. I feel like we've talked enough about the general ideas.
No, but I think it's a good place to start because one of the things that's interesting, at least from my knowledge, right, of I guess women's rights in Canada, and I think this is where a lot of this can connect back to the trad wife element comes in, right? Or that you mentioned, is that when I learned about women's suffrage and so on, or just women's movements in Canada, this is kind of the end point for a lot of people and a lot of education systems, at least here in Quebec. And I think that's a problem because if your entire education system, say in high school, and then you can get into like, university where you're taking like hyper-specific classes, but for the average person, if all you learn about is up to a certain point, feminism existed, and then they got the right to vote a little bit later in Quebec in 1940, and then it just stopped, it does give this impression that everything that women or minority groups are asking for is just a little bit of extra that is completely unnecessary. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing such a backlash against women's movements today.
100%.
Yeah.
It's like that. It's like the old adage that used to go around for a lot of guys. They're like, I'm not a feminist. I'm an equal opportunities person because feminism is priority. It's like feminism is about equal opportunity. It's not about prioritizing women. It's about giving them the due that they always should have had.
And stopping it in this time period ignores the fact that it is a constant struggle, an ongoing struggle. And you were mentioning like non-Western feminisms. Yes, right. That is one of the more recent, right, or at least still active.
But hey, we had a black president. Racism's fixed.
We had a woman vice president, right?
Woman vice president of color. Everything's fixed.
She
almost won an election. Here. She almost won an election.
We had a woman prime minister here who didn't win an election.
Yeah. How was she in like a couple months?
Yeah, just to replace Mulroney, and then she lost the election.
Whoopsies are bad.
Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, so I do think that ties into that desire, that impulse. Trad feminism is this lack of knowledge of history, or at least this limitation on where we end that history.
Yeah, and I think it's also just like whenever there is some sort of major social, cultural reform or change, there's almost right after it always this intense period of backlash. You saw it in the U.S. like post Abraham Lincoln winning the Civil War and all that. Things almost got more racist because like Jim Crow laws automatically came into effect and all these other factors, and then we get. Again, it's just these people that are like, well, now it's my turn. You had your turn. My turn again. Back to me. And so I think that's something probably to look at as well with these, like, looking at the Quebec history of women's feminism, as you were saying. It probably was, again, that backlash. Like, they got the right to vote. It's like, okay, you got the right to vote now. 1940s right to vote. Maurice Duplessis take over.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, God.
When will it be the white man's turn?
I don't know much about Maurice Duplessis' specific policies, but towards women, but I can't imagine they were very.
The man was focused on the idea of like bringing in old Catholic values. That's never good for women.
No, but see, it was also during his time. No, sorry, that's not true. It wasn't during his time that got his vote. It was like during a brief period where he was not prime minister that they got vote here. So, yeah, premier.
You mean premier?
Yes, sorry. My apologies.
And you're getting your PhD in Canadian history and culture.
I just corrected myself. Jesus Christ.
No, you have to be right all the time. We live in a post-correction society.
It's the real cancel culture. You have to be correct all the time.
Or just never, ever say or do anything at all.
That's cool. I'm okay with that. Just exit into the vacuum of space. Launch me into the sun so I don't have to do anything.
Let's go. Well, I mean, even on this whole post-apocalyptic thing, fucking Pokemon got in on the game now. Their newest game is a post-apocalyptic Pokemon game where humans destroyed the environment and then launched themselves in a rocket to get away from the Earth.
Nice.
So
that's really awesome.
That's the state of the world we're in. Even Pokemon is doing post-apocalyptic ecocide. But back to feminism.
So as you were mentioning, right, Catholicism was a major driving force in Quebec for most of its history. Still is.
Yes.
In many ways.
And yeah. I'm not trying to say if you're a Catholic, you're anti-feminist. I want to make that very, very clear.
No.
Not necessarily. However, religion is one of the most common uses, excuses, and tools to remove the rights of like women, minority groups, the LGBTQ plus community, most of all.
You can see this really big distinction between different interpretations of Catholicism or just religion in general. For example, in the United States, where Christianity, whether it's Protestant or Catholicism, is extremely conservative right now. But if you look just in South America, you have radical movements like what we call liberation theology, which actively use the teachings of Christ and their interpretations of Christ to overthrow governments or try to overthrow governments.
100%.
In the name of
the only thing the Bible was ever explicitly clear on was how to build a table. You haven't seen that post? Because like somebody brings up like it's a passage where like Jesus says specifically how big the table should be, blah blah blah, and there is like, well, he was a carpenter.
That tracks. I mean, he did whip those bankers, so that's cool.
True.
Good for my boy Jesus on that one.
But yeah. So again, Catholicism not inherently the problem. Use of Catholicism and religion as an excuse to be an asshole.
Yeah. So in this case, the Catholic institution, right, which is very much tied to the state at this time in Quebec,
which is always a bad sign,
right? But it was relatively normal at the time, so who's gonna bat an eye against that? So it was very conservative. Right? It was a conservative institution. It barely wanted votes for men, let alone women as well. Right. And let's not even talk about, as you were saying, all of those other minority groups. So throughout like the 1920s and 30s, the conservative, Catholic, nationalist institutions very much resisted provincial enfranchisement for women. But that's not to say that there weren't active groups, right, that were trying to instill it. It wasn't a totalitarian state either. So you could still have these groups that were trying to advocate for it. It just wasn't going very far, right, for a very long time. So, for example, one of the larger groups at first is what's called the Montreal Local Council of Women, which is exactly as it sounds, basically a women's social club that was advocating for suffrage, right, and women's rights. And this one was formed at the end of the 19th century. If memory, I didn't write it down in my notes, but if memory serves, it was like the 1893, 94 or something like that. So you still had these movements. But what's interesting about the Montreal Council of Women, Montreal Local Council of Women, is that even within their own ranks, the French-speaking women were a minority, right? So English-speaking women were very active in it. And it's not because they didn't try. It was intended to bridge English and French-speaking women, and bring them together. It's just that culturally, French women were, again, much more Catholic and would have, inhabited a much more conservative milieu, which made it more difficult for them to participate or to justify participating in groups like this.
Well, again, it's the I'm not trying to say it's all equal, but it is
Mhm.
again that case of like francophone women and then anglophone women are different cultures, and that's a different intersectionality of minority groups.
Yeah. Okay. So especially at the time, right? Today, you might argue that those boundaries are a little bit blurrier, right?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, right. But especially at the time when French usually meant Catholic, English usually meant Protestant, um, immigrant versus quote unquote pure laine, right? And so on and so forth. There's
Yeah,
all
on all
kinds
these
of
like
division lines, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, but I think that's a really good point to bring up. And
That's
one
why
that
like
certainly.
so like we look at it's like, oh, why can't all the women work together? And it's like
Mhm.
they're not the same cultural group. So like we like to clown on the idea of the francophone and the Quebecois on this show a
Sure.
lot, don't get me
Sure.
wrong. But also like
I never noticed.
yeah, there have been periods of time where one group or the other has been the prosecuted one
Oh, 100%. Right.
to a fairly
Um,
strong degree.
no, for sure. I think again we're slowly coming up to Quebec independence movements. The idea behind it, I get it, right? Like the especially at the time. Today less so, but the motivation behind it, I think, had
Yeah,
a reasonable backing. And this is one of them.
100%.
It's like culturally it was very distinct, and there were economic differences as well, right? As to come
Yeah.
back to what you were saying. Generally, also, francophone families were a little bit poorer, right? Less educated. That's not to say that this was the fact across the line necessarily, but it did contribute to them being less informed about certain issues
Mhm.
at times, which made it more difficult to have access to some of these ideas. Um, but you still saw, so by 1907, for example, you had francophone feminists such as Marie Lacoste Gérin-Lajoie, who
Yeah.
actually drew on Catholic feminism, right, to establish what was called the Fédération Nationale Saint-Jean-Baptiste, which concentrated on kind of bringing together some Catholic values like charity, education, and so on,
Yeah.
and and feminism, right? So having what is considered traditionally women's work, right, charity, home economics, if you will, right,
Mhm.
and kind of channel
Home ec,
that,
baby.
right, and kind of channel that um, into women's productive social work, right, and having them
Yeah.
be contributing members of society in valued work, right? In this
Yeah.
case through charity. But it's interesting because she apparently actively avoided the question of suffrage, right? That wasn't quite there because it didn't have a place in like Catholic dogma, so to speak, right? So it didn't
Mhm.
interest her. But you are starting to see people think actively about um, Catholic ideas and how to incorporate, women's issues into it, even if it's not suffrage, so to speak.
Yeah.
Which cool. I don't
Yeah.
know if you have
Cool.
anything to. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add on that. It's just interesting at the beginning of the 20th century.
No, I like it.
Yeah,
I think the name's very Marie Lacoste Gérin Lajoie.
yeah. Just hitting all those French Canadian names in one. Let's go.
10 out of 10. 10 out of 10 name.
All names you still see
God.
today. Great.
The Francophones have the best names in Quebec.
100%. Fantastic.
Francophone names beat Anglophone names any time of the week. As my father says, there's a very vast chasm of difference between the quality of a name like Camille, which is, and then Camille. For
But
any
yeah,
of our
one of them,
listeners who go by Camille, just say Camille, please.
one of them rolls off the tongue. It's nice and smooth. The other one
I
sounds like
think
you have a
all
potato.
Camilles are angels. I don't just say because Patrick's partner's name is Camille.
Let me think really. She
Well, she would know if she just listens to the pod.
does not. She listens to half the pod because she has to, because she's in the next room. And that's about it.
Yep.
Okay, so on the other side, right, while you did have the Montreal Local Council of Women that did try to bridge English and French, you did have Montreal Anglophones who created the Montreal Suffrage Association, which lasted from 1913 to 1919. And in 1919, when that fell apart, the franchise committee for the Montreal's Women Club continued on that struggle. So you did see kind of one group after another going on that train. And then the Provincial Franchise Committee, which is the one that we're going to stay on for the rest of the episode, had established itself in 1922, right? And what was interesting about the Provincial Franchise Committee is that it had a dual leadership, right? One French leader and one English leader. And their goal was actively and firmly to put into women's suffrage. So I find that kind of nice, right? Like a bilingual dual leadership for women, by women, so on and so forth, right in 1922. Obviously, for listeners who are paying attention, women wouldn't get the right to vote in Quebec until 1940. So that's 18 years of struggle that they're going to have to go through, because there was still a lot of concerted efforts against this group.
Right.
Yeah. So there are two, before we get into the literature, there are two figures that I wanted to talk about. Some of our French Canadian listeners have probably heard of them. I just wanted to overview some of their work, who they were, and how they were active. And I even have an excerpt of some of their speeches that I wanted to share with you, and then we'll kind of go over some of the literature for the end.
Do it.
So I'm curious, because I know you can speak somewhat. So have you ever heard the name Thérèse Casgrain?
I think vaguely in other conversations and other things we've looked at.
Yeah. I've heard her name, Casgrain, because I shouldn't dox myself like that. My street name is named after her, I think. I think she's the same Casgrain. I'm not sure, but because there's a million Casgrains, but I think she's the same Casgrain.
That's cool.
Yeah. So she is someone who spent her entire life in politics, and she was born into an affluent Quebec family, but that never stopped her from advocating for the rights of every woman, not just a bourgeois woman or anything like that from her her social standing, I guess, but the working woman as well, and so on. And she actually ran as a liberal in 1942 in Charlevoix-Saguenay, and sat on the Wartime Prices and Trades Board. In 1946, she actively joined the CCF, which, as we've talked about before, was the predecessor to the modern-day NDP. And she actually was head of the CCF in Quebec, making her, in 1951, the first female party leader in all of Canada.
Yeah.
So, great. Good politics, good ideas, good for you, Thérèse. You're doing great.
You're doing great.
I say that not knowing every single detail about her. If there's some dirt on her, we never liked her.
Well, I mean, nobody's going to be perfect.
No.
Like, if you go in expecting perfection and squeaky clean, first of all, you're a hypocrite, because you're not perfect or squeaky clean either.
But yeah, she was one of the... So Thérèse Casgrain was one of the people who worked both within traditional parties, right, as a liberal and as a CCFer, but also alongside the PFC, right, the Provincial Franchise Committee. So she was very much active in all kinds of groups. And she even founded the League for Women's Rights in 1928. So again, very active. And she was one of the people who even advocated for women being allowed to be included, I guess, in their platform, in the Liberal platform and in the Liberal Party in and of itself. Do you actually have the link open for the speech that I linked to in the show notes?
Hold on, I'm bringing it up. There you go. The speech.
So what I linked to, we're not going to read all of it. It's not a very long speech, but we're not going to read all of it. But what I linked to is a really interesting piece. So as we mentioned, after decades of struggle, in 1940, the Liberal government granted Quebec women the right to vote. So
Yeah.
for a brief moment, the Liberal government was in power, and uh, the Duplessis kind of shadow, if you will, had very briefly lifted just enough to. Pascal gave this speech, which is really interesting because it's called "The Right to Vote is Not an End in and of Itself," which I think is a really great place to start because it's very easy to sit on your laurels, say, "Great, we've achieved the right to vote, we can stop." But it's very, I think, informative to see that a woman like Casgrain, who fought her entire life, refused that much.
Well, it's one of those things it's almost how movements can live or die depending on how they structure or because sometimes people will say, no, I'm tired. I'm tired of fighting. The fighting is burned out of me. Sometimes that's the other side response, like we gave you the thing, can't you just stop fighting for a second? We can just have some peace.
Exactly.
Blah blah blah.
No. Permanent revolution all the time.
Yeah. That's not exhausting. That's not going to burn people out.
No, but I do think, especially on the level of politics and reform, which is.
Well, I think her speech
mainly
is still
what this
good, and
is.
it's good for her to recognize that things aren't done.
Exactly.
I just think it's also important to recognize throughout revolution movements, like that's an important thing to take into account. Is
Yes.
how long realistically can you have people fight, as it were?
I wanted to read just the first part because I think she is a pretty good orator and a very good communicator. Unless you want to read
to it. No, you
or
got
unless-
this. You rip into it, boy.
So, so obviously this is a translation, but we secured the right to vote a year ago today, after several years of what seemed a fruitless battle. At the time of this victory, several sources said to us, quote, "Now that you have what you wanted, your struggle is over and you can run." These words make me think of those romance novels in which the hero always marries the heroine at the end. What we forget is that the real story begins only after the wedding. This offer to relax was no doubt made with the best of intentions, but it shows, sadly, that there are those who have misunderstood the reason and hold behind our struggle. The right to vote is not, and could never be, an end of itself. It is a means, a defensive weapon. Banger.
Yeah.
And true.
Banger.
Yep.
Banger.
Yeah, but I like that, right? The idea that the right to vote is a defensive weapon. What do you think of that as a looking back now, almost 100 years ago? What do you think of such a statement and what it might imply?
Which one?
That the right to vote is a defensive weapon.
Oh. 100%. The right to vote is not something you use for offense. It's something you use to, like, again, you're voting to keep certain things out or keep certain things away.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're not really voting to cause the change. You're voting to protect the other thing.
Right. Which goes a long way also to for today, right? Whenever we say like, oh, we're voting for certain things, right? We're voting for a specific government or voting for a specific idea. Yes, but also there has to be more. Right?
Well, it's very indicative of that mindset and that idea, and I think it is like a very fair mindset to have. Is very indicative of how slow change is in a government.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you just rely on democracy to get it done, it's going to take a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the rest of the rest of the speech is basically her outlining of what else needs to be done, right? Or what voting will help do. So, for example, the subsections, education is key, right? So actually using education to shape civic responsibilities and women's ability to discuss and talk about these issues and then vote on them. She talks about equal pay for equal work, which in 1941, pretty cool, right? This is something that you'll hear today. Right? She talks about safeguarding human dignity, right? And she asks the question, right? Can women caretakers of the home deal with the problems of slums, the cancer that is inexorably eating away at the social fabric and attacks the very essence of the family, right? So all of these social problems, whether it's education or equal rights, all of these are already at the forefront in the 1940s, right after getting free. I think that's really fascinating. To have that level of awareness is not something that maybe people were aware of that a lot of feminists at the time have, but I think it's a refreshing perspective to say that, like, no, these ideas are not necessarily.
Yeah.
Reproductive rights part is not there, of course, because that would only really come with like the 70s or late 60s, but I can't fault her for that. That's just not much of an idea that was like as popular, especially not in conservative Quebec.
No.
But yeah, so I just wanted to highlight her. She continued to be active throughout the 60s. She was very much outspoken against the Vietnam War and nuclear armament. So Chad.
Both things to be good against.
Yep.
Good things to be against.
Good. 67, she founded the Fédération des Femmes du Québec, and she was nominated to the Senate in 1970, where she had to resign on her 75th birthday. And because she was forced to resign on her 75th birthday, she actually started to campaign against compulsory retirement. So she was like, no, this is bullshit. I want to keep going. And that was her like little hobby horse for the rest of her life. That's kind of fun. The other person that is most often talked about in these circles is a woman by the name of Idola Saint-Jean, who was a Montreal-based teacher, and she worked with
Gotta love the teachers.
Gotta love them. Again, not surprising, right? That teachers encounter all kinds of people and situations, are usually at the forefront of these types of ideas. So yeah, and she started working as on the assistance committee during the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, and she would give lectures on hygiene. And by 1922, as she saw who was most impacted by the Spanish flu epidemic and just worsening conditions in society post World War I, she was more and more mobilized by feminist demands.
Yeah.
Which again, not exactly surprising, right? As you kind of see post-war apocalypse happening, you're like, okay, maybe there's something we should change about society. And yes, 1928, the same year that Casgrain founded the League for the Rights of Women, Saint-Jean would found the Alliance Canadienne pour le vote des femmes du Québec.
Right.
So, again, a lot happening in the 1920s and 30s. Saint-Jean didn't necessarily act as much on the political sphere like Casgrain did. She didn't necessarily join as active political parties, right, like the CCF and so on, but she was much more active on the writing side. Was a journalist, a columnist, all of that. So it's good to see that people are have different approaches. She, for example, wrote a regular column on women's demands for the Montreal Herald. From 1933 onward, she published the magazine that was called La Sphère Féminine, and she appeared on like panels on women's demands on the radio and federal and provincial commissions. She was really outspoken and very much committed to the cause.
Right. Okay.
Let's see. The last note I have on her is that in the 1930s, the Alliance and the League for Women's Rights organized numerous educational campaigns for suffrage bills, but they all failed. So that's cool. I don't know what I intended with that note.
They tried their best.
Again, it's hard to gauge failure of an education campaign. Yeah, but they weren't successful insofar as until 1944.
Right.
I don't know. I didn't have much else to say on Saint-Jean. I don't want this to be an episode all on just two women because I feel like it'll end up being just a list of achievements for them. But yeah, I don't know. Is there anything you wanted to say before we just did a quick section on women's literature at the time?
No, I think we're good to go into this.
Cool.
Again, it does go to show like this was started back in the early part of the 20th century and just kept going. It took decades to really build to actually get to.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So for those of you who are depressed about climate, just keep pushing, but push harder. Keep not
Keep going.
Keep going.
That's Patrick's attempt at optimism for the month.
I was gonna advocate for some like eco-terrorism there for a second, but like no, maybe not.
Hey, Poison Ivy's an okay comic book character.
I heard that Absolute Poison Ivy's a real banger.
Oh my god, she's crazy. It's awesome. Not even she anymore. She's all 6 of the animal kingdoms.
So what's interesting about this literature at the time is that it doesn't reflect a lot of the suffrage movement, at least not in Quebec. What you see is a lot of books that will hit on it here and there, but that are less pedantic, or pedantic's not the word I'm looking for. What's the word I'm looking for? You might know this, where you're really hammering home a single point. Shoot. There's a word for that. Doesn't matter. I'll think of it sometime. But yeah, so you don't really see that. So usually what you saw in the late 30s and early, throughout the 1930s, is very melodramatic types of novels, right, that were aimed at women. So these novels were things like Peuvent-elles garder un secret, which was published in 1937 and literally translates to Can They Keep a Secret? And things like novels of jealousy and seduction, basically the 1930s equivalent of an airport novel, right? Totally fine, but just nothing to write home about necessarily.
Well, again, it's those books are surprisingly economically, like, they make money.
Yes.
Which isn't nothing for women's authors to actually be able to make a living from their work. So all you smut writers out there, you keep on going, man.
That's what's interesting. Matt, you know this as a literature major. Who was the novel originally targeted to as a form?
Oh, wasn't it women? I was like women of because they were sitting at the idea was they were sitting at home so they could buy the periodicals.
Yeah, exactly. I would argue that, I wouldn't necessarily put the obviously classic 1937 Can They Keep a Secret on the same level as Frankenstein, right?
Or Don Quixote.
Right. But the idea of having these novels being meant for women and by women did mean that the topics that they addressed are rather indicative of what interested women at the time. Right? And
it's again to create a modern comparison. The romantasy boom currently of like romantic fantasy and all that. And you know what? I've read some of them. They're not half bad. They're actually like they're fun, good reads.
I'm sure.
It's not Tolstoy, but fuck, I'd rather read this than Tolstoy if I'm being honest.
First of all, blasphemy. How dare you? But I get it. No.
Sometimes I just want a Domino's pizza, okay? It doesn't need to be oven baked all the time.
No, for sure. But even if it is a Domino's pizza, you can still, understand that the point was to get women to read.
And who better to get women to read than women writers who knew what women actually liked? Because men writing women, oh boy.
Mm-hmm. But so there's a bit of a double-edged sword because often women writers had to, in order to sell their books, had to appeal to male-headed publishers. Right, who are like, oh, well, obviously women want the saucy romance, right? This is just womanly things. So what you start to see is, yes, women kind of appealing to the demands of the market, so to speak, but also including little bits and pieces of suffrage messaging, some issues that actually like in stories. So that's not just a saucy romance, but it's an illicit love affair.
Yeah.
Or dealing with bigamy, and more by the end of the 1930s and into the early 1940s, describing urban life and speaking of women's suffrage, right? Which is it seems like a minor thing to do, right? Talking about urban life. It wasn't a very common thing, as the urban life was considered seedy and where the underbelly was. So you couldn't necessarily talk about that in proper women's literature.
Yeah.
So it is interesting to see that. If people want a good example of this kind of novel that describes urban life while speaking of women's suffrage, I would point them to Adrienne Maillet's L'Oncle des Jumeaux Pomponel. So the uncle of the Pomponel twins would be the translation of that one. I don't know if an English translation exists, or even if you can still get the book anywhere. But I think I found it on Archive or something like that. So.
Okay. We love Archive.
Oh yeah, big stan. I saw one article that I read for this episode describe that these novels that I've been describing constituted a kind of ideological erosion through which the forms of deviance and the presence of the real world gradually made themselves felt. And I think that's a really good way of describing that, right? Right. So these novels were usually on the fringes of official ideology and really closer to real life, and they opened the way for like psychological novels, and which itself was like more impervious to ideological debates from sources. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything you wanted to add about like that literary scene?
About the ideology?
The ideology behind it. So,
it just goes to show there's no ideology that can stand up to capitalism.
But I mean, slowly but surely they got through to it. Kind of.
Yeah.
Isn't that the whole point of art, though? I guess in literature,
That's
that you
true.
kind of like slowly undermine it. I'm not saying
it's the postmodern.
Yes, I'm not saying that it's that those books were what helped actively women's suffrage, but it did contribute to an ideological shift, I would say.
Oh, 100. Again, as women making money, I'm all for it.
Mm-hmm.
Me and Patrick are talking about the person who held my job, my position that I currently have before me, which is a fairly well-paid job and position, was a woman, and there is a little bit of like well, that's kind of shit then. That kind of sucks.
Yeah.
So I definitely think like, and I'm not joking when I say capitalism wins in the end. That's what happened. These women made money, so they were then able to support themselves, and whether or not they donated money to women's causes, they were then able to sort of be standouts, and then other women would have made money that they donated. Like, it's a chain effect.
Yes. Right. You can
do
what
you
can.
With any movement, you just need the money to do it.
Yeah, or the. Yeah. So one of the things that I also wanted to highlight was the emergence of modern women's magazines, which again we tend to ignore as part of literature, right? Like, oh, it's just a throwaway magazine that you get in the mail. Sometimes you don't even want it, right? You read it in the waiting room or whatever like that, and then you forget about it. But I think it's something that is worth bringing up as part of this whole suffrage movement or women's rights movement. Mac, just to give my voice a bit of a rest so that I can drink some water, why do you think that might be? Why might women's magazine be an important part of this discussion?
Because it is their form of communication. It's their form of discussion. Women's magazines are like not something that's gone away. And like, as we were saying earlier, the periodical, which was the original magazine, was targeted at women. It's the way, it's almost their form of like information, communication, and all that. And it is very much something that is almost, again, still with some governing and control by men, but it's still very much a female-dominated space.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's their sort of space where they can have these discussions, if that makes sort of sense, without actually having to worry. I'm not going to say they were encoding secret messages of resistance, but they were propagating ideas most likely that would have changed the ideals of the time and made people believe in something else.
And so far, it wasn't encoded. It was sometimes very explicit, right? That's what the point of these magazines were, right? And I think one of the things that helps women's magazines, to add on to what you're saying, is that and just any magazine, is that unlike a novel, which is meant to tell a specific story, the very form of the magazine is bringing together all kinds of bits and pieces, very much helps
and
it.
it broadens, it opens the worldview a bit, or it can anyway, when done correctly.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, right, all the way in 1919, we had La Revue Moderne, right? I'm just looking at a book right now that I have open, um, which is um, which is the establishment, which is really seen by historians of publication as the establishment of women's magazines in Quebec, right? So all the way back in 100 years ago, 105 years ago.
Yeah.
And its editor was a woman. It wasn't led by a man necessarily. It was a woman from the start. And this woman, Anne-Marie Gleason, was an experienced journalist, and she wanted to create a general circulation culture that was similar to Parisian magazines like La Revue des Deux Mondes, right? And it was meant to specifically cater to female audiences.
Yep.
And apparently, according to, and this I'm reading from the history of the book in Canada, which is a great volume. But women's magazines like this, right, quickly rose to becoming very popular. It had a monthly circulation by 1922 of about 20,000 readers, which is huge in 1922, especially for women's readers. So fantastic stuff. But then you have other ones like Le Bulletin des Agriculteurs, which was mainly appealing to women as well, which reached by the end of the 1930s, right, 60,000 readers, and then by the end of the 1940s, 140,000 readers. So this really had a mass appeal to women audiences in Quebec. So one of the interesting shifts that you also see happening around this time is that women's magazines prior to the 1910s and 1920s were often marketed as like quote unquote family magazines, right? There's a little bit of like how to do this little thing as a housewife, or a little bit of how to, do this chore in the home. And then slowly you see in the 1920s and 30s, you see a shift where it's much more, what are the recent events? What are local gatherings? What can you do to help your local suffrage movement? That kind of stuff.
Well, it's also like to take those self-help columns and all that into perspective as well. Those played a part in how they were. A lot of the solutions came from like women of minority colored groups that had all these solutions from decades of work. So that is also like eroding a cultural barrier and better supporting like women with other women.
Yes, absolutely. Right. So obviously at the time they wouldn't have necessarily acknowledged that, the women of color angle.
No, but I think it is an unseen effect.
Yes, absolutely. And it's also worth highlighting that you see a similar shift. This is more after women achieve suffrage, but it's still part of the broader movement that I find is worth highlighting.
Part of the movement, man.
Is that in 1933 in Montreal, you see the founding of the Société d'études et de conférences. So for non-French speakers, literally the Society of Study and Conferences. Okay. Which sounds boring, but that's just literally my life every day. That's just going to societies like this. So, and it is pretty boring. But what's interesting about this society, which for all intents and purposes is an academic one, its membership was exclusively female, right, from the start. And so their entire goal was to organize lectures on literary and scholarly topics to improve the members' general knowledge. So it ties into what Thérèse Casgrain was talking about earlier about education being a major part of women's rights and ability to express themselves.
Right.
And this society really shows this being put into action. And it was actually, by the way, wildly successful. Right. So between 1933 and 1980, they had over 600 lecturers, including none other than Jean-Paul Sartre, René Lévesque, Paul-Émile Bordua, all kinds of very well-known speakers and artists of all kinds. I think it ended in 1980 as an organization. Oh no, it still continues. Sorry, never mind. Yeah, but yeah, again, 100 years of educating women, or women-led education, which of course continues to this day. Yeah, I don't know. We've been talking for about an hour here. Do you have anything that you want to add about anything that I've said, or like that we've talked about, that you think is worth highlighting here? I didn't mean this to be like a particularly long episode, because some of the stuff we've already talked about in previous episodes. So I did want to retread some of those things.
No, I think you're on the right track. And I think that it is, I think it does go to show how, because this is almost a common idea in a lot of feminist focused media, even going back to, say, the Restoration period, where women's power, women's control is very much derived from what are seen as traditionally more feminine characteristics of, like, they work beneath the notice of men, if that makes sense.
Good.
And that's something that carries into the modern day. Handmaid's Tale very similarly. And that's always sort of been so it's an interesting sort of viewpoint but and then from there you can see there actually is an argument to be made of getting power through that way, and the power that comes through that kind of.
Yeah, and what's the whole conceit of The Handmaid's Tale? How is the story actually told?
Oh, isn't it from her journals or something?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So again, I think Atwood very deliberately did this. This is not an accident, but like writing.
Oh God, no! Knowing Atwood, it would not be an accident.
No, right? Writing being an ideological, tool, I guess, or something that can erode mainstream ideologies. Absolutely,
100%.
But yeah, I don't know. I wanted to highlight some of these things. I guess read some of these books if they're really interesting to you that I've mentioned. I don't think they'll be super accessible or probably very good compared to like our standards today, but they're at least an interesting piece of history.
Okay.
Yeah. And if anything, take magazines like Chatelaine seriously sometimes. They're not as stupid as they seem.
Right. Not anymore. Not right now, anyway.
Yeah. Anyway. Mac, what is our next episode going to be about when we see each other again in like 2 months?
Handmaid's Tale.
Oh my God.
We're going to skip over the next 50, 60 years. It's boring and worthless.
All of it? Okay. That's fine.
It's boring and I hate it.
Let's see. I have A.M. Klein, which is on the second scroll. So that would be like Jewish writing in Canada, modern Jewish writing. Bernard d'Occasion, which is French writing outside of Quebec. Lives of the Saints, so Italian Canadians. Oh, we can go back to Hugh MacLennan and talk about the Two Solitudes.
Let's go.
Or I don't remember.
I do love me some Two Solitudes. Why do I feel like I've read that one before?
You might have. He's the same writer who did Barometer Rising.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Oh, by the way, just to continue before we finish the episode, if any listeners are in Montreal, go see Goblin Macbeth. It was really good. It's literally...
We talk about it in more detail on Pop Canada.
No, this is a different Macbeth. So I went to see
how many Macbeths have you seen?
So in the last 2 weeks, I saw 2 different versions of Macbeth. In the last 3 weeks, I saw 3 different Shakespeares. It's just pure coincidence that there's so many being put on in Montreal. So the one I saw last Thursday was Goblin Macbeth, which is literally about 3 goblins who find a copy of Shakespeare and decide to put on Macbeth. It's funny. It's great.
I love that.
That's it. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. We'll do one of those episodes. We'll see. All right. So, Mac, thank you for everything today.
Thank you for everything.
Do you have anything you want to plug before we leave?
Hold on. Sneezing. Unmuted sneezing done. The war in Iraq is wrong. Or Iran, sorry. The war in Iran is wrong.
Yeah.
That's your plug for the day.
Cool. And subscribe to our Patreon if you want. If you don't, no worries. Anyway, catch you on the flip side, everyone.
Thanks, guys.